Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah shir. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel Amir Hashem today. We will be learning Daf Kuf Nun Gimel Amud Beis. We are picking up with a brand new Siman today on Kuf Nun Gimel Amud Aleph, 3 lines off the bottom of the Shulchan Aruch. Siman Shin Chaf Gimel. Dinei Hasha'olah V'Kinyan Tzarchei Shabbos. The halachas that govern borrowing or acquiring things that you need for Shabbos. V'hadachas HaKelim, washing and cleaning kelim. V'tikunan, repairing things. V'tfilasan, being tovel kelim. If you buy a new keli and you have a brand new keli, you want to use it on Shabbos, and you have to do tfilas kelim b'Shabbos. We're going to discuss all of these halachas and what you can do and what you cannot do on Shabbos. Uba yud seifim, and here we have 10 seifim. Our learning today should be a schus for Achenu Kabeis Yisrael Hanasunim Bat Sarah Uba Shivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayom Ubein Bayabasha Hamakom Yerachem Aleihem V'Yitziim Mitzar L'Rvacha Me'afela La'Oiro Mishibud L'Geula Hashta Bagalo V'Zman Kariv V'Nemar Amen. Our learning should be a schus for Shalema for Yehoshua Levi Ben Ahuva Malka Chana Yitzchak Ben Tzion Ben Dusha Rivka Bashir Aleach Avadasa Baserel. They should all have Refuah Shalema B'Sar Shar Chayla Yisrael, and the limud HaTorah of Klal Yisrael should be a schus. The Rabbanim Shalom should watch over Gans Klal Yisrael B'Chol Makom Shehem. Now, by way of Hakdama to today's shir, there are really two main Isurei Shabbos that we're going to be dealing with today. One is the Isser of Mekach Memkar, engaging in any sort of business dealings on Shabbos. Now, why is Mekach Memkar also on Shabbos? The Rishonim give various reasons. It's an Issa D'Rabbanan. One reason given in the Rishonim, you can find this in a Rashi, is that Chazal learned out from the Pasuk in Yeshaya, Pasuk that we've mentioned already many, many times. The Pasuk says that on Shabbos, you should refrain mimtzoi cheftzecha, from pursuing your own needs, your own pursuits. Mimtzoi cheftzecha. From the words Mimtzoi cheftzecha, Chazal darshaned chafatzecha asurin. You're not allowed to pursue your own asakim, your own tirdus, your own busyness. Your business, you're not allowed to go pursue. That's one reason that's brought down. Another reason that's brought down is that Chazal asered Mekach Memkar because they were afraid that engaging in any kind of business is going to bring about writing, right? Because you engage in business, you have to write things down. You have to keep records. So they were afraid that involvement in business is going to bring one to Ksiva. Kaisev is one of the Lamates Malachas. That would be an Isser Da'araisa. There's one more reason. There's one more reason. Give me a second. It'll come back to me. Yeah, there's a famous Shitas Ramban. The Ramban says that engaging in business on Shabbos can very well be an Isser Aseh, because in context of Shabbos, the Pasuk says Shabbosoin. Shabbos, right? What do we call Shabbos? We call Shabbos a day of rest. So Shabbos is supposed to be a menucha. It's supposed to be Shabbosoin. Engaging in business would be the opposite of Shabbosoin, and it would actually be an Isser Aseh. So that's the first Isser that we're going to be dealing with, and that is the Isser D'Rabbanan of Mekach Memkar. Then there's another Issa D'Rabbanan that we're going to be dealing with, and that is the Issa D'Rabbanan of Medida, measuring. And we dealt with this already previously in Siman Shin Vav. You're not allowed to measure things out on Shabbos. You're not allowed to weigh things. You're not allowed to use a measuring cup to measure out 2 cups of something. Medida is Asar on Shabbos. Why is Medida Asar on Shabbos? The truth is, from the Mishnah Berurah in Siman Shin Vav, it seems that Medida is Asar on Shabbos because of Uvdin Dechoil. It's very much a weekday activity. When do you measure things out? Well, measuring would be part and parcel of Mekach Memkar. You go to the bakery and you ask for a pound of cake, you ask for a pound of deli, you ask for a quart of a liquid, you ask for a gallon of a liquid. So certainly, Medida is a major part of Mekach Memkar. Also, Medida is something that you do when you're cooking recipes, you're measuring out ingredients, etc., etc. So Medida very much is looked upon as being an Uvdan D'Chayil. It's a weekday activity. It's antithetical to Shabbos. Now, these are the 2 Isurim that we're going to be dealing with. The context is it's Shabbos, and somebody needs something for his Shabbos Suda. So it's Shabbos, he has guests coming, and he realizes he doesn't have enough wine, or he doesn't have enough of some other drink, he doesn't have enough water, he doesn't have enough beer. And he needs some more. How's he going to get it? He can't go ahead and purchase anything, mekach umemkar. But what he wants to do is, he wants to find some way that he should be able to go to a moicher, he should be able to go to a vendor who has these types of items and normally sells these types of items, and he wants to be able to go get what he needs. How can that be done? And what you have to fix in your mind for today's share is, we're dealing here largely with optics. What do I mean by that? Chazal wanted to be matir, this fellow, to be able to get what he needs. Remember, these are Isurei D'Rabbanan that we're talking about. Now, Isurei D'Rabbanan are Isurim. They're not belittling Isurei D'Rabbanan, but they're Isurei D'Rabbanan. And the Chazal wanted this individual to be able to get hold of whatever he needs for his Shabbos Suda. They don't want his Shabbos Suda to be lacking. So the question is, how could we be matir this person to go get what he needs? And the answer is going to be that we need to avoid, of course we need to avoid any actual mekach umemkar. You can't actually go and buy a cup of wine. That's for certain not. But not only do we need to avoid actual mekach umemkar, we need to avoid the appearance of mekach umemkar. We need to create a situation where the person is going to be able to get what he needs, and it doesn't look, smell, sound like mekach umemkar. That's what we're working to avoid. We don't want it to seem to be mekach umemkar. We want to be able to look at this and say, not really mekach umemkar. It's not muchach that this is mekach umemkar. The same thing when it comes to medida. If there's going to be any measuring involved over here, now why should there be measuring involved? Very simple. Let's say you have a vendor who sells wine by the cup. You know, we're used to a very commercialized society nowadays, where what do you mean? You go to the store, you buy a bottle. You take a sealed bottle off the shelf. Even when it comes, I mentioned the bakery before. I mean, for years and years and years, you walked into the bakery, you said, give me a pound of 7-layer cake. Give me a pound of kukush. No more. Now everything is prepackaged in those plastic containers. You go to the shelf, you take a plastic container, you go and you buy it. It wasn't that way until relatively recently. Right? So the problem over here is, this fellow is going to go get wine. The vendor sells the wine by the cup. Now, the purchaser is going to pay for this wine after Shabbos. Let's get that straight. We know we're being matir the buyer who needs the wine for Shabbos. We're figuring out a way that it's mutter for him to go to the vendor and get the wine. And he shouldn't do mekach umemkar on Shabbos, and it shouldn't look like mekach umemkar on Shabbos. But there's no question. Everybody understands that after Shabbos, he is going to pay for the wine that he takes. And that being the case, the seller needs to know how much wine he gave to the purchaser, so that on Sunday, they could sit down together and, okay, you bought 3 cups of Cabernet. You owe me for 3 cups of Cabernet. So it can't be haphazard. There is going to be medida going on over here. But medida is a problem. How do we get medida accomplished over here without running afoul of the Issa D'Rabbanan of medida? Now, just one other quick thing I want to mention about medida, and that is, we saw in the Mishnah Berurah in Siman Shin Vav that while medida is an Issa D'Rabbanan, the Chavetz Chaim says that the Issa D'Rabbanan of medida is a relatively kal. It's a relatively lenient Issa D'Rabbanan. Why? Because it belongs to that category of things that are also D'Rabbanan because of uvdin d'choil. It's not that it's an Issa D'Rabbanan. You know, we have Isurei D'Rabbanan that are gzeris, right? We're afraid if you engage in mekach umemkar, you might come to ksiva. All right, that is a gzera, where it's a syug. We're putting a fence around the Isurei D'Oraisa. We're making an Issa D'Rabbanan. You shouldn't come to an Issa D'Oraisa. That's a very chomor, a very stringent type of Issa D'Rabbanan. Uvdin d'choil is an Issa D'Rabbanan because you want to do something that's antithetical to Shabbos. It's kind of like protecting Kedushas Shabbos. It's protecting the ambiance and the atmosphere of Shabbos. But we're not protecting Yisur Daraisa. So the Chavetz Chaim says that Uvdin Dechayil is a relatively lenient category of Yisur Darabanan. One place where that comes out is that we are matir medida litzorich mitzvah. The Mechaber told us in Shin Vav, you're allowed to measure a mikveh. If a woman needs a mikveh on Friday night, and there's a question, is there enough water in the mikveh? Is the mikveh the proper size? You're allowed to measure, because that's tzarchei mitzvah. Now, we're not matir uli suri rabbanon in the face of tzarchei mitzvah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, uvdin dechayil, we could be matir litzarech mitzvah. So against that backdrop, let's see what's going on over here. Again, let's imagine we have a fellow. He's going home for the Shabbos Suda. He realizes he doesn't have enough wine. He wants to go to the wine merchant, and he wants to buy a quart of wine. Okay. Mutter loy malachaveroi, says the Mechaber Sif Aleph. Mutter loy malachaveroi, you're allowed to go to your friend, meaning the vendor, and you're allowed to say to him, Male li klize, fill up this keli with wine. Which keli? We're going to speak about that in a minute. But high level, you're walking into the vendor and you say, do me a favor, fill up this keli with Cabernet for me. Now, did you say, sell me this keli, a full keli of Cabernet? Did you say, give me a full keli of Cabernet? No. You said, do me a favor, fill up this keli of Cabernet for me. Mutter loy malachaveroi male li klize. Okay. Furthermore, says the Mechaber, you could do this. Afilu hu miyuchad limida. Even if the keli that we're dealing with is a keli of a fixed size, and it's a keli that is used for measuring out a fixed volume of wine. So here's where you see, we're coming up here against two Yisurim. One Yisur is Pashat Yisur of Mekach Memkar. You're going to the merchant and you're asking the merchant you need wine. He's going to give you wine. So we're coming up against Mekach Memkar. The other thing that we're coming up against here is Medida. Because again, the vendor has to know how much wine he gave you. He has to know what you owe him, right? So you're saying Male li klizeh, but you're not grabbing some random keli. If you grabbed a random keli, how is anybody going to know what money has to change hands after Shabbos? So no, we're not dealing with a random keli. We're dealing with a quart. We're dealing with a 750 mil. We're dealing with a half gallon. We're dealing with something that is a kli miyuchad lamida. And says the Mechaber, you're allowed to do this. You could. Now, which keli are we talking about? What keli? Whose keli? Where is this keli? Says the Mechaber, v'hani mili. When are you allowed to do this? You're allowed to do this when you're going to take the keli from the vendor, and you're going to bring it home. In other words, how does the trade usually work? The way the trade usually works is, if you, at least in those days, if you wanted to buy a half gallon of wine, what you did was, you came with a keli from your house, not necessarily a half gallon keli. It might be bigger than a half gallon keli. You might come with a gallon keli. But you came with a keli from your house. You went to the wine merchant and you said, please sell me a half a gallon of wine. Okay. The merchant took a half gallon keli, filled it up from the barrel, and then he poured it over into your keli. So that's the normal derech mekach memkar in those days. The wine merchant had a barrel of wine, and then he had kalim of differing sizes. So one person came in and said, please, can I buy a cup of wine? So the merchant went to his barrel, he ladled out wine, and he poured it into his 1 cup measuring cup, and then he poured it over into your keli. You want 750 mil of wine? Okay, the wine merchant had a 750 keli. He ladled out from his wine barrel. He filled up 750. He poured it over to your keli. You went home. That's the way it was normally done. But we can't do it in the normal way because it's Shabbos. If we do it in the normal way, it looks, smells, and tastes like Mekach Memkar. So we can't do it in the normal way. So what does the Mechaber say we have to do? What's going to happen over here is this fellow's going to come into the wine merchant and he's going to say, do me a favor, fill up that keli. He'll point to the quart keli. Fill up that keli for me with wine. And the merchant will fill up his own quart keli, hand it to the meicher, and the meicher will take it home. That's very atypical. That's not the way Mekach Umemkar is done. And therefore, this does not have the appearance of Mekach Umemkar. Let's go further on the discussion of the keli. Says the Mechaber, there's another way you could do this. The Ein Tzarech Leimer, I don't need to tell you, im mevi alekeach mitoich beisai, if the lekeach would bring his own keli, va'omer loy male li klizeh, and say, fill up this keli. Oh, what's this scenario? This scenario is the purchaser goes home, he brings from his house his own 1 quart keli, and he presents it to the vendor, and he says, fill up this keli for me. Now the vendor is not using his measuring utensils, he's not using his kalim, he's ladling out straight from the barrel into the purchaser's keli. That's also atypical, not the way it's normally done. Again, the way it's normally done is the vendor takes his measuring keli. You want a quart? The vendor fills up his quart keli, pours it over into your keli. That's the normal fashion. That's not what's happening. You're bringing a quart bottle of your own, and the vendor is filling up your quart bottle directly from the barrel. That's atypical. That's not derech mekach umemkar. Continues the Mechaber. Let's finish the sif. Continues the Mechaber. So ve'ein tzarech leimer maybe lekach mitach beisav ameli male li klizeh. Aval, however, limdoid bekli hamayuchad lemida, but for the vendor to use his measuring cup, v'lishpaich l'seich kelev shel lekeach, and then fill up the keli of the lekeach, aser. That's aser. Why is that aser? Because that's derech mekach umemkar. So again, this fellow needs wine for Shabbos. Mekach umemkar, aser. It's a drabanan. You can't do mekach umemkar on Shabbos. Also, we have to have some way of recording how much wine changed hands. So there's going to be medida in some way, shape, or form. There's going to be medida going on here. How could we possibly be matir this? The first thing that we see very clearly is that we're going to be matir the mekach umemkar element by making everything very atypical. Now, first what you see over here is that in the phraseology that the purchaser is using, nowhere did he say sell me, nowhere did he say give me. All he said was male li klizeh, fill up this keli for me. There's no mention of a transaction. So right away, since there's no mention of a transaction, that already mitigates the mekach umemkar issue. The other factors that are going to mitigate the mekach umemkar issue is that this whole transaction is going to be done in a very atypical fashion. What we do with the keli and how the wine is going to change hands is not going to be done in the normal way. And since it's atypical, that is also going to mitigate the mekach umemkar piece. Now, how about the medida piece? How about the measuring piece? How are we mitigating that? The bottom line is, even if the purchaser brings his own quart keli, right, when the vendor fills up the quart keli, he knows he's filling up a quart, and after Shabbos, he's going to claim back, he's going to tell the purchaser, you owe me a quart for a quart of wine that you took on Shabbos. So no matter what keli you're using over here, there is medida going on. So it would seem from the language of the Mishnah Berurah, and it's very clear in Yarach HaShulchan, that the way we're getting out of medida over here is that no measurement is ever being mentioned. Nobody's saying, give me a quart of wine. Nobody's saying, give me a cup of wine. All that's being said is, fill up this keli. Now, it happens to be that the keli has a fixed measure. But when somebody says fill up this keli, and you go ahead and you fill up the keli, that the optics are not the optics of medida. This doesn't look like I'm going ahead and I'm measuring out a quart. No, you said fill me up a keli. I filled up a keli for you. That's all. So the Aruch HaShulchan says, since there's no mention of medida, ein zeh, his exact words, I wrote it down here, his exact words were, Kevon she'enoi masker loy shum davar, since you're not mentioning anything about medida, eino medida. It's not medida. That's it. What does he mean? He means that it's not an act of measuring. When just because the cup happens to be a fixed size, do me a favor, fill that up with water. That doesn't mean measure me out a quart. That's fill up the keli. So you filled up the keli. So the Aruch HaShulchan says that is not medida. We're going to see in another Mishnah Berurah where it's implied from the Mishnah Berurah that another mitigating factor over here is that because the language is just fill me up this keli, and the vendor fills up the keli and gives it to you, says the Mishnah Berurah, sometimes if somebody came in and asked for a drink, and the vendor was willing to give the guy a drink as a matana, he would also use that keli. So, okay, just because he's filling up a measuring keli doesn't mean that he's doing measuring. Maybe that's the keli that he had. You want a drink? Here's a drink. Okay, now with all that background, I think we could move through a lot of the Mishnah Berurah now. Let's take a look here. It says the Mishnah Berurah is cotton aleph. Mutter. Hainu. After Mekach u'Memkar also b'Shabbos, even though we have an Issa D'Rabbanan of Mekach u'Memkar b'Shabbos for Yom Tov, ve'echad ha'moicher b'peh. The Issa D'Rabbanan of Mekach u'Memkar deals even with a verbal sale. What does that mean, a verbal sale? Where somebody says, I will sell it to you. Or you say, please sell me X. And the vendor says, okay. That's a verbal agreement for a sale. That's also on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Or if you actually allow product, if you actually transfer ownership of a product, that's also Mekach u'Memkar. V'chein, and also, medida she'eina shel mitzvah gam ken aser. And medida, if it's not medida shel mitzvah, is also on Shabbos. So these are the two isurim that we need to be dealing with here. So how is it mutar loim lechaverim alili klizeh? Afilu hu miyuchad lemida. Explains the Mishnah Berurah. V'chanal b'sivichin vav. Afilu hachi, still in all, in the face of both of these isurim, mutar loimar b'lashon zeh. You're allowed to go ahead and say, fill up this keli for me. She'ena arma b'lashon mechira mecharli, because you never said mecharli. You didn't use a language of mechira. You didn't say sell to me. You didn't even say tainli. You didn't even say give me. Ve'ena maskir shemida. And you never mentioned a measurement. Like the Aruch HaShulchan says, you didn't say a quart. So there's no medida here. Rak klizestam. All you did, you said, was fill up this keli for me. Ice cotton base, this is mutter, even if the keli is miyuchad lemida, pirish haraga limdoid v'limkarbay. Even if it's a keli that you typically use to dole out and sell a fixed measurement of what it is that you're selling. Ice cotton gimel. The Mechaber said the way you have to do this is that you're going to go to the vendor, and instead of the vendor using his measuring keli and then pouring it into your keli, no, he's going to fill up his measuring keli and you're going to take it. So you're going to point to his measuring keli and you're going to say, do me a favor, fill me up that keli of wine. And he's going to fill it up, and he's going to give it to you, and you're going to take it home. Says the Mishnah Berurah, why is this okay? Shein zeh derech Mekach u'Memkar. This is not derech Mekach. This is atypical. The gam, and also, loy mechzik uvdin dechoil. It also doesn't look like uvdin dechoil. What does the Mishnah Berurah mean? That's a remez to medida. What the Mishnah Berurah, the Chavetz Chaim, I believe, means here is, it's not Mekach remez, two problems. It's not Mekach u'Memkar, because it's not the derech of Mekach u'Memkar. It's also not uvdin dechoil. Code words for, it's also not obviously medida. Why not? Sha'af ha'mashkes chavera b'derech matana. Even if the vendor wanted to give the fellow a drink as a gift, darkei gamke lepamim lahashkes b'kli hamayuchad lemida. Sometimes he would just fill up the measuring keli and give it to you. Here, go take a drink. Ice cotton dalid avalim died. But to go ahead and do it in the normal way, to have the vendor use his measuring keli and then pour it over into the purchaser's keli, that would be aser. Because that's Mekach Memkar 101, that is aser. Now we go to the Ramah, top line, near the end of the line, says the Ramah Hagah. V'yesh b'kilin loymar. There are those that are makel to say, and this is a very, very well-known kula in the Isser of Medida. V'yesh b'kilin loymar. There are those that are makel to say, D'chol she'enoi mechaven limida legamri. Whenever you measure out something, but you do it imprecisely. So you don't fill up a cup. You fill up a little less than a cup or a little more than a cup. Shemimayit oy moisif ma'at, where you short the measurement a little or you go over the measurement a little. Shari, that would be mutter. V'chein aminik poshet limdoid b'kli hamiyuchad lamida v'lishpaich lekelav shelokeach. And the Ramah says, indeed, it is the minig that in such situations you would do it in relatively the normal way. You would allow the moicher to use his measuring cup and to pour it over into the cup of the lekeach. And it would seem that what the Ramah is saying is, the minig pashut is to mitigate the mekach memkar problem just with the lashon, just with the phraseology of the transaction. The phraseology of the transaction was, fill up this keli for me. There was no mecharli, there was no tainli. That mitigates the mekach memkar issue. And as far as the medida issue, we're not going to have a medida issue because he's going to fill up the keli imprecisely. He's going to go a little over, he's going to go a little under, and that's going to mitigate the medida issue. Now that might also mitigate the mekach memkar issue. And the reason it might mitigate the mekach memkar issue is because it's not derech mekach memkar to be imprecise. The derech of mekach memkar is to be very precise, right? If a person's running a business and he's always being imprecise with his measurements, right, his business might not last a very long time. So normally, when people are engaged in trade, they want to be very precise with their measurements. So the fact that he's being imprecise with the measurement may actually serve as a mitigating factor to the Isser of Mekach Memkar as well. I'm not sure that that's clear in the words of the Ramah or in the words of the Mishnah Berurah, but that's what I'm reading between the lines. So again, you have one mitigating factor when it comes to Mekach Memkar, which is the lashon, the phraseology that's being used. Nobody's saying mecharli, nobody's saying tainli, it's only male li klizeh. So that's a mitigating factor of Mekach Memkar. There's a mitigating factor in Medida, which is that the Medida is going to be done imprecisely, and therefore it's not uvdin d'chayil, it's not the way it's normally done, it's not a proper Medida. That might also serve as a mitigating factor to Mekach Memkar, because it's not derech Mekach Memkar to be imprecise. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois cotton hey v'yesh mekilin hainu dal yedei zeh ein iser ala moicha limdoid b'kli mida shaloi v'lishpay l'say kelev shaloi keach. What the Ramah is saying when he says yesh mekilin, the Ramah is a little bit vague, right? The Ramah didn't directly address the scenario that we're speaking about. The Ramah just said some people are makel that when you do medida and you do it imprecisely, the medida is mutter. So explains to Mishnah Berurah, what the Ramah is telling you is, now plug that into our scenario. In our scenario, the moicher would be allowed to measure imprecisely in his keli and give it to the lekeach. He's going to short the measurement a little bit. The Mishnah Berurah asks what really should be an obvious question. Wait a second. How are you shorting the measurement? This fellow is coming and saying, Male li klizeh. He points to a quart container. Male li klizeh. Now, you're going to go ahead and you're going to short the quart. That rhymes. Now on Sunday, the vendor is going to go to the purchaser and say, you owe me for a quart. No, I don't. You shorted the quart. I don't owe you for a full quart. L'chayra, if you take money for a full quart, isn't that gezel? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Ve'ein bazeh mishum gezel. Sheyadu leba'olav shakal regila mekach. Because this is the derech, and everybody knows that it's the derech, and therefore everybody accepts it, and it is not also mishum gezel. Another minig he says that people had in such situations where they had to be imprecise were on Shabbos, right? So here it is, it's Shabbos. Male li klizeh. I have to be imprecise with the measurement. Take off a ring, drop a ring into the bottle. Now obviously the measurement is going to be imprecise because the ring displaces a certain amount of whatever the liquid is that's going into the container. Okay, weiter in the Ramah. The Ramah says, 3 lines down near the end of the line, the Ramah tells us that in Sif Dalid, we're going to delve a little bit more into the rationale behind this shita that is mekel. And now a little bit of an aside point here, says the Ramah. Din halvas Shabbos dinoi k'may b'yomtiv. As far as arranging loans at Shabbos, the same halacha would apply as I don't mean arranging loans as in arranging a mortgage on a house. I mean borrowing things on Shabbos, borrowing wine, borrowing potatoes. Din halvas Shabbos dinoi k'may b'yomtiv. Baby potatoes wasn't the best choice since we don't eat potatoes raw. Borrowing tomatoes. The halachas that govern borrowing things and lending things on Shabbos are the same as the halachas on Yom Tov. V'ayin lekamon siman tov kuf chav hey ula'el siman shin zayin sif yud aleph, where we saw various restrictions. Again, there are restrictions on the type of language that you need to use. There are restrictions and caveats about how the claims and the monetary settlements have to be made after Shabbos, etc., etc. Ayin sham. Oiskan zayin yispar b'samach hainu shamatza smach shel pa'amim mutar lahasker av shemida vayin shamach shekasavdu bazeh. The Ramah is going to say shortly in Sif Dalid where there are times that you actually can mention measurement amounts, and it could be mutar. We'll see that in the Ramah in Sif Dalid. Boy, we're going late, so let's move on. Sif Beis. Mutar loyman lachavera. You're allowed to say to someone else, Maleli klizeh, fill up this keli for me. So again, you need wine for the Suda. You bring your keli, you say Maleli klizeh. Or according to the Mechaber, you're not bringing, well, yeah, you could bring your own keli. So you bring your own keli and you say, fill up this keli for me. Ulamachar nimdaidaisai. And tomorrow we'll measure it. Now, there are 2 distinct chidushim in this line of Mechaber. What's happening over here? What's happening over here is Ruvain is the fellow who needs the wine. Shimon is the vendor. Ruvain is going over to Shimon the vendor, and he's saying, Male li klizeh, fill up this keli with wine for me. Ulamachar nimdoidaisai. Tomorrow, Sunday, we'll measure it. Well, what's implicit in those words? Implicit in those words is, tomorrow we'll measure it, and we'll make a cheshbon, and I'll pay you what I owe you. So by saying this, it is sort of, it's definitely much more implicit that there is a business deal going on over here. This smells a lot more like Mekach u'Memkar. And yet, the Mechaber says this is mutter. Because again, what did you say? You said, Male li klizeh. You didn't say, give me. You didn't say, sell me. You said, Male li klizeh. Even though it's rather implicit in your words that a cheshbon is going to be made on Sunday, nevertheless, this is mutter. That's Chiddush number 1. Chiddush number 2 is you're saying, Ulamachar nimdoid oisai. Tomorrow we will measure it. Now, are you allowed to measure things on Shabbos? No. So how are you allowed to talk about measuring things on Shabbos? Daber davar. Whatever it's also for you to do on Shabbos, you're not allowed to say that you're going to do on Shabbos. Right? You're not allowed to say, I'm going to drive to Muncie tonight. You're not allowed to say that because you're not allowed to drive on Shabbos. Right? So how are you allowed to say, we'll measure it tomorrow? Says, well, let's just finish the sif first. Says the Ramah, while this is mutter, avaloy yoymar tein li mida pleinus. The Ramah points out, there's a line that you can't cross. The Mechaber is saying, you could say, we'll measure it tomorrow. Right? But what you can't say is, you can't say, give me a quart. Yes, the Mechaber is, pushing the limits a little, and he's telling you that you're allowed to mention medida. You're allowed to mention measuring. But you're not allowed to mention the measure, says the Ramah. Okay? Says the Mishnah Berurah, ches mutter. Hainu, afshe hamedida also b'Shabbos v'Yom Tov, even though the act of measuring is also on Shabbos and Yom Tov, mikamokam mutter la'azkiroi. You're still allowed to mention the measuring. Even though in Shin Zayin we said you're not allowed to say that I am going to do something tomorrow if that thing is also to do on Shabbos. The Pri Megadim says, no, maybe we're being matter this because it's being done l'tzarei Shabbos, and I think this harkens back to what I mentioned at the beginning of the shir, that the Mishnah Berurah in Shin Vav says that Medida itself is, so to speak, a shvache iser. It's a more kuladika iser of uvdin dechayil, and therefore l'tzarich mitzvah, we relax it somewhat. So it could be over here also, l'tzarich Shabbos, we're relaxing it. Ice cotton test, Ramah said, Avalo Yoimar, says the Mishnah Berurah, Vafilu ein kaina mimenu klal, elo shoyel mimenu. Even if somebody is not buying, he's not looking to buy something from somebody, he's only looking to borrow. You go to your neighbor and you want to borrow wine. You're not buying wine from him. You're going to pay him, you're going to give him back wine. Va'imar hashileni mida plainis gamkin asa mishum medida. You're not allowed to go to your neighbor and say, lend me a cup of wine. The heavy uvdin dechayel v'chanal b'simin shinvav. Aiskan yud mida plainis. The Ramah said you can't mention a specific measurement, a chetzia, or half of a known unit. So you can't say, give me a half a cup, or a half a gallon, or revius, or a quarter. So that's a quart. Kevich mazkir shem mida. You cannot mention the name of the unit. But an interesting kula, says the Chavetz Chaim, you could say, you know how measuring cups have lines on them? You could say, give me to the third line. So you're not mentioning the Shem Hamida. You're not mentioning the unit. You're saying, give me till the third line. Okay, now go along to Sif Gimel. You could say to your friend, Tain li beitzim ve'egoizim, give me eggs or nuts, b'minyan, by a number. So you could say, please give me 6 eggs. You could say, please give me 20 almonds. So a number you could designate. Says the Mishnah Berurah b'minyan. Hainu she'omer lo yasara oy esrim. You say, give me 10, give me 20. Shekein derech balabayis liyois mayne b'sech beisai leida kamahu noitel. Because counting eggs, counting nuts, that doesn't shmek of mekach umemkar. Again, what we're looking to avoid here, we're looking to avoid the optics of mekach umemkar. When somebody counts out 20 almonds, that does not automatically look like mekach umemkar. Because people in their own house, when they're not dealing with anybody else, they count out, I need 4 eggs. They count out eggs. You know, so to count things out b'minyan like that, that doesn't automatically shmek of mekach umemkar, and that is mutter. People count because they want to know that they're only taking what they need. It doesn't shmek. It's not proven that this is being done to keep track of the money. Siv Daled, says the Mechaber, Mutter loimer lechenveni, you're allowed to say to a vendor, Tainli arba beitzim, give me 4 eggs, v'chamesh rimoinim, or give me 5 pomegranates. Or both. You go to the vendor, do me a favor, give me 4 eggs, give me 5 pomegranates. Again, we're dealing on Shabbos. You need eggs. You need pomegranates. You need to avoid the appearance of mekach umemkar. You're allowed to go to the chenveni and say, do me a favor, give me 4 eggs and 5 pomegranates. Now, the Bir Halacha points out in Dibra Mascha Lechenveni Tainli that this so far is the same exact halacha that we learnt in Siv Gimel. In Siv Gimel, the Mechaber said you could go to your chaveroi, you could go to your friend, and you could say, give me 4 eggs, give me 20 nuts. What's the point of that, Mechaber? Again, what you're doing is to avoid the appearance of mekach umemkar. You're allowed to use a minyan. You're allowed to use a number. Here, too, in Sif Daled, you're allowed to go to the vendor and say, give me 4 eggs and 5 pomegranates. And that avoids the appearance of mekach umemkar, because when you use a number, we don't see mekach umemkar. The chiddush is coming now. Ubelvad, however, what you cannot do, ubelvad, shelo yaskir loi shem damim. You can't mention money. The Mishnah Berurah says that what that means is you can't say, give me $5 worth of eggs. V'loi schum mida. You can't mention, the Gra changes this word schum, he changes it to shame. You can't mention a measurement. You can't say, give me a pound. You can't say, give me a cup. That you can't do. V'loi schum minyan. You also can't mention a number. What does that mean, a number? We just said that you're allowed to mention numbers. You're allowed to say, give me 6 eggs. So what does it mean, ever loy schum minyan? Explains the Mechaber, I'll tell you what I mean. Loymar, that means to say, you can't say, Harei sheyesh lecha biyadi chamishim egoizim. you have in my hands 50 nuts. What does that mean? What the purchaser is telling the vendor on Shabbos is, I already owe you for 50 nuts. Tein li chamishim acherim. Give me another 50 nuts. V'harei yesh lecha biyadi meya. And now I'm going to owe you for 100 nuts. So here are the two different scenarios. The scenario that's mutter is, you could go to the vendor and say, give me 20 nuts. That you could do. You didn't mention money. You didn't say, you didn't use language that is, that's mecher. You didn't use purchasing language. There's nothing, you didn't mention money. There's nothing here that's automatically mekach memkar. You didn't mention a measurement, which is also would make it mekach memkar. You didn't mention a measurement. All you said was, give me 4 eggs and 5 pomegranates. That's okay. And when the moicher is counting out the eggs and the pomegranates, that's also not automatically mekach memkar, because it's normal to do that in your own house. It's normal to count things out. So that doesn't scream mekach memkar. But what's aser? What's aser? What's aser is, if you have a chenvedi, you have a vendor that you deal with often, and you already owe him for 6 dozen eggs, you can't go to the vendor now and say, do me a favor, give me another 12 eggs. I already owe you for 6 dozen eggs. Now I'll owe you for 7 dozen eggs. That you can't do, because now you're making a cheshbon. That is mekach memkar 101. You're going to your vendor and you're making a cheshbon with your vendor. Mekach memkar 101. That you can't do. Okay, let's see the Mishnah Berurah here. Mishnah Berurah is cutting your base, loimer lechenveni. Dafke chenveni Yisrael. First of all, the Mishnah Berurah just points out that you could only buy eggs on Shabbos from a chenveni Yisrael, from a Yiddish vendor. Aval eini Yehudi also likach b'ben beitzim. But from a non-Jewish vendor, you can't go ahead and buy eggs or get eggs on Shabbos. Get by mekach memkar, but you can't use any of these scenarios to go get eggs from a non-Jewish vendor on Shabbos. Why? Because Shemin Noldu Hayom. Maybe the egg was laid today, and the egg that's laid today is aser. And you have no way of knowing, muktzah, the egg would be muktzah. V'chein b'ri moinim. And also with pomegranates, the same halach is true. You can't go and get pomegranates from a non-Jewish vendor on Shabbos. Why? Shemin nilketu hayom and amachuber. Because maybe it was picked off the tree today. Now, in most places nowadays, this wouldn't be negeya. You go to a vendor who sells eggs, it's not that he has chickens in his backyard. He's getting them from a wholesaler. Ice cutting Yud Gimel. The Mechaber said you cannot mention shame damim. What does that mean? Pshutim were the currency of the time of the Chavetz Chaim. So you can't say, give me $5 worth of eggs. The choshked kishkamaskel schum damim. Certainly, you can't make a monetary cheshbon with him. Pshita the aser. What the Mishnah Berurah means is you can't go to the vendor and say, I already owe you $27. Give me another $3 of eggs. I'll owe you an even 30. Can't do that. Again, all because the optics of mekach memkar. I cut your dalit v'loy schum mida. You're not allowed to mention a total measurement. Ayin b'bir agrosha kasav the tasayfer who. This is a typo. V'tzark leimer v'loy shame mida. We should take out the word schum and put in the word shame. Dahainu shamaska loy tein li mida ploinus. What it means is you can't say give me a pound. You can't do that. You can't mention the measure. V'choshken schum mida. Dahainu sha'isi imay cheshben hakol mikama midas shalakach mimenu ekvar. Or certainly you can't go ahead and say, I already owe you for 10 pounds. Give me another 2 pounds. I'll owe you for 12 pounds. Ice cut and tezvav v'loy schum minyan, and you can't mention a total minyan. And then the Mechaber explained what did he mean by that. He meant was you tell the vendor, I already owe you for 50 nuts. Give me another 50 nuts. I'll owe you for 100 nuts. That's what schum minyan means. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ice cut and tezvav v'loy schum minyan. The problem with all of these things, again, is the optics of mekach memkar. Of a minyan ba'alma, give me 20 nuts. That we said in Sif Gimel and in the beginning of Sif Dalid that would be mutter. Okay, I guess we will continue next time with the words of the Ramah, even though tomorrow's page is also quite lengthy. but we'll have to deal with it. All right? Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. So limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rosh should said, Yeshua's the first Parnassah Sheduchim to those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Kayel Tzedek b'meher v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.